Hi everyone, I'm Sally Wilson and we have something a little bit different for you today. Instead of me interviewing somebody else, the wonderful Alix Bradfield, who has joined us, is going to interview me. Welcome, Alix.
Thank you, Sal. Thank you.
So, listeners and watchers, Alix recently authored a book called Energy for Life. She also spent decades as a relationships counsellor, a career strategy consultant, a columnist, and also as a trustee of a philanthropic trust. And she actually made this suggestion to me the other day. She said, Sal, these interviews they're all great, but has anyone ever interviewed you about what you're doing? So hence we have our program for today. So I'm actually going to just completely hand it over to you now, Alix.
Oh, thank you, Sally.
Thank you.
Are you happy with going way back to the beginning? What do you remember about being a child?
Well, what I remember was growing up on a farm, loving my childhood. I have one older brother and had lots of animals. And one of the things that particularly stands out from that time was how I already loved to sing. And like all kids, loved that world of the imagination. But I remember, dressing up and going out into the paddocks with all of my jewelry on as a child, all of it, all at once, and singing. So there are lots of wonderful, wonderful memories from that time. There were also times that were really hard, during the drought, the really bad drought. I think it was in sort of 86 or somewhere around there. That was a very, very tough time. But all in all, it was growing up on a farm, going to school in a very small town nearby. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I have a vision, Sal, of you with your jewelry on, singing to the cows or the sheep. Who was the audience?
Yeah, the sheep, and I loved horses. So, rode horses, but mainly sang to the sheep. Yes.
Yeah, they would have loved it. I'm sure they would have loved it. Oh. So you're talking already about singing at a very young age. And where did this interest in music start? And it started way back then, but how did it develop into an interest and a passion for opera?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, we were very fortunate at my primary school, Darren Allen Primary School in Western Victoria, to have an extraordinary music teacher. Now, that was by no means normal at the time, but we had also a wonderful headmaster, Jack Elliott, for quite a few years, and he recognised the value in teaching classroom music. So all of us got a music education with Mrs. Gilmore, Ruth Gilmore, who was the music teacher, and she also ran a choir for any of us kids who were interested during lunchtime, school lunch times. And she was a real disciplinarian, at least that's how I remember her. She seems like such a softie now when I go and see her. But, and I just remember learning harmony. In the classroom music, we all learnt rhythm, we all learnt how to read music. But in choir, those moments where we got to sing in harmony were some of the most uplifting moments I can remember. They talk about the endorphins that are released when we sing, particularly when we sing in a group. And apparently it's the same as, the endorphins that monkeys produce when they're grooming each other. So it's like this mass grooming going on when we're singing. But she encouraged me, and I remember, we used to, as a choir, go to the country Eisteddfods, and we always won. So it was a great source of pride for that little school. And one year she said, does anybody want to do a solo? And I was like, oh yeah. A few other kids were like, oh yeah. So she prepared us to do solos. That was the first solo I sang. I remember singing in a performance. I can still remember it. In a Spanish garden, there's a little tree. It goes on like that. So I've still got a recording of this little baby Sal voice.
How old were you?
I'll have to look up the date on the tape. Yes, it's a cassette tape. I think I was probably 9.
What an exceptional school and an exceptional headmaster and teacher to
Yep.
have included that, because I learned only recently the correlation between music education and learning to read. And so often music is considered a nice to have instead of an essential part of an education.
Yeah. Yep. And, you know, I did another episode of the podcast with James Cuskelly, who talks about that. He's a music educator. And, you know, and for people who can't afford to give their kids music lessons, it's not about giving them music lessons. It doesn't have to be at all. It's singing them little songs as you bounce them on your knee. And it's just incorporating these aspects of music into life, because, well, it's a part of who we are.
In every culture, it's just so important. So now, what was your first singing? But how did you get from there onto the operatic stage, Sal?
Yeah, well, okay. So I, you know, kept being encouraged by some amazing teachers. You know, Tom Healy was my choir director at in secondary school, and his wife Helen Seymour. They were amazing supporters. And anyway, that sort of, you know, that kept happening, the solos and the choirs and orchestras and piano and all that sort of stuff. I was very fortunate that I had those opportunities and that support. And then when I left secondary school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I had quite a broad range of interests, and I just didn't know whether I wanted to do music professionally. And so I thought, well, I actually need a year. So I took a gap year, what we call a gap year now. And I thought, I just need a year where it's all different, where everything's different, where I'm out of my, I didn't think of it in these terms at the time, comfort zone. One of the things I really wanted was to actually feel like a foreigner. I wanted to be somewhere where I felt like a foreigner. I don't know why. I mean, as a 17, 18-year-old.
In a country town where everyone would have known everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. But then, you know, secondary school was boarding school. Yeah, but I just felt like I had been in the very fortunate position of feeling safe, feeling like I belonged, and there was a part of me that was aware that not everybody has that experience. And so I went off to Japan for a year. I'd studied Japanese at school, went off to Japan for a year, worked in a traditional hotel with a kimono on and, you know, kind of extreme sorts of things. Worked in a karaoke bar, studied Aikido, studied, you know, ceramics and things like that. And came back to Australia a year later. I thought, no, I still don't know whether I want to do music professionally. So then I started an arts degree because it gave me the opportunity to study all these things that I knew I was fascinated in. I just didn't quite know where they were going. And then after a year of that, I thought, no, I'm ready. I want to do this professionally. So I started studying music at the Melbourne Conservatorium. At that point, I actually wasn't that keen on opera. It was art song that I loved, art song and chamber music. But very few people make a living singing art songs. So I studied opera as well. And once you study it and once your technique really improves and you feel the exhilaration of producing that sound, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes years and years and years. But once that sort of clicks in, then it is exhilarating. Not always, but it often is, just producing that sound and collaborating and with orchestras, and, you know, it's an extraordinary feeling. So that's how I then started to study music, and I went to the States on an exchange to Pennsylvania State University because they had a great program there with all sorts of wonderful subjects for singers, you know, pedagogy, you know, vocal pedagogy, and lots of opportunities for performance and doing operatic scenes. And, you know, we were allowed to, we had the opportunity to get up and perform every week there. And that was amazing. yeah, so really good teachers. And then from there, I did a summer school, the Chautauqua Summer School. I don't know if it's still running. And that's where I saw other kids, I shouldn't say kids, young adults in their, sort of late teens, early 20s, who were studying at Juilliard and the Manhattan School of Music and places like that, and Curtis and stuff. And I thought, oh, that's where I need to go. Because, I mean, these were exceptional singers and performers, a lot of them. And that's how I wound up at the Manhattan School of Music to finish off, finally, a degree. I got a degree.
Yeah. But much learning in between.
A huge amount of learning. Huge. Yeah.
But then you went to London. You were in London, were you not?
Yeah. So I started my career in the States, and after a few years, I just thought, I just want to experience other countries and the sort of music making that goes on in other places. And I'd spent a little bit of time in Europe, like when I was at Melbourne Uni. I'd got a scholarship to go and just study Italian in Italy. And it was one of those, people who are listening, young people out there, I only got this scholarship because nobody knew it existed. And so I went to the scholarships or whatever it is department and said, hey, this is what I need to do. Are there any scholarships for that? And there was. So it's always worth asking. But then, after a few years of performing in the States, I thought, no, I need to experience some different places. So I went to and lived in. I got a 6-month job, actually. I think it was about 6 months at the Savoy Opera in London. So I went over, auditioned, got the gig. So that meant it was much easier to move over then than it would have been otherwise. And I was in London for 3 years. Yeah.
Well, I would love this. I'd love to have the hour or so that we have together just to explore more about your musical career. But you've moved on from then, and I'm fascinated to understand a little bit of how you made this challenging change between your operatic career to helping individuals who are struggling with trauma. It just seems unrelated, except actually there's an awful lot of trauma in opera, isn't there? Yeah, not just the heroines. No, you're absolutely right. It seems like a big jump, but it all happened really quite organically. So when my husband and I eventually moved back to Australia in 2013. We'd been living in Germany for 6 years. Gosh, I don't quite know where to start with this. It's sort of we'd be, So I was singing Carmen, right, in Switzerland, and I stood on the stage, and I suddenly realized it's not worth it anymore. And a couple of months later, we were heading back to Australia. And when I say it's not worth it anymore, you do make a lot of sacrifices. They don't feel like sacrifices when it's still the right thing for you to be doing. But, you miss out on time with family. You're on the go. You don't have a stable community. You're often living out of suitcases. And it's not a stable life. You don't have a guaranteed income and all those sorts of things. But it was mainly the community and sort of feeling like I was missing out on time with my family as well, who were, back here in Australia. And I had a little niece. I didn't want to miss out on her growing up. So we moved back to Australia. And one of the things that I did when we moved back was start teaching at a university in Melbourne. And I realized quite quickly that the majority of my students weren't coping. They weren't coping with life very well, let alone trying to develop a career in music, for which you need a lot of resilience. And a lot of these young people I was seeing them week after week on a weekly basis. A lot of these people were getting help already with their anxiety or their panic attacks or their depression, or, when
teaching singing is a very personal thing. When you're commenting on somebody's voice and you hear everything reflected in the voice, it often becomes quite a close relationship. And so these students would share certain things with me because I could always tell when I heard them come and sing that when things weren't quite right in their lives. And so I started asking the other teachers, well, what's your experience? I mean, are your students coping well? Are they, dealing with a whole lot of mental health issues that mine seem to be dealing with? And I found that it was pretty consistent, also among the students of the other teachers that are having similar experiences. And I thought, well, what these young people are doing in terms of the help that they're getting, it just didn't seem to be working very quickly. And in some cases, it didn't seem to be really making much of a difference, to be honest. And so I started to just question that a bit and think, well, surely there must be a better way. There must be things that work, that really work. I mean, if our mind has the capacity to sort of take us there, then it has the capacity to get us out of there. And when I look back on the opera and all that sort of thing, it's 2020 vision. You see those sorts of issues that of course singers were experiencing as well. Some were able to rehearse really well, but not able to perform, or these sorts of things happening. So anyway, once I kind of thought, right, well, we need to find a better solution. One of the teachers at this university has and had an aunt called Judith Richards. And this colleague said to me, my aunt does this thing. Maybe you should talk to her and see, ask her what she thinks and see what her thing's all about. And that's where I came across the Richards trauma process.
Which I'd love to hear more about, and also how you differentiate it, Sally, from other forms of therapy.
Yeah. So the Richards trauma process works with somebody's subconscious. So when we have symptoms like anxiety, chronic worry, chronic stress, chronic overwhelm, the things that I mentioned before, depression, panic attacks, they're symptoms of distressing stuff that's happened in our past. And I say distressing stuff because when we say trauma, most of us think of war zones, domestic violence, which is a huge problem, or, rape, or, extreme distress.
Yes.
But when I talk about trauma, I cover the whole spectrum. So there is the extreme distress, and there are also things that happen to us when we're kids, which when we look back on as adults, we think, oh, come on, that was nothing. But to that little child, it could have been huge. The loss of, sorry?
At the time,
it changed their lives and their perspective on lives, and perhaps their perspective on themselves. Some examples might be the death of their first animal, or it might be one day getting lost. And the thing is also our nervous system is picking up information from when we're in utero. So if something distressing happened to our mother when she was pregnant with us, no, of course, it's not in our conscious memory, but our nervous system has already onboarded that information, which is often, I'm not safe. And so the same things also affect us in terms of preventing our best performance. It's stuff that's happened in the past that hasn't been properly resolved in our subconscious mind and filed away properly as a memory that's complete, that's not going round and round and round in our systems. Stuff that's led us to beliefs like, I'm not enough. Whatever I do, it's not enough, or I don't belong. When you look at high achievers, and high achievers form a big part of my clientele, high achievers in business and sports and the performing arts, the things that prevent their best performance are often things that stem from childhood. And often these are people who had what they considered fantastic childhoods, Yeah.
And I'm just thinking now, when you mention events perhaps in utero with your mother being depressed or upset or anxious herself that passed through the umbilical cord somehow, how, if someone doesn't even remember these things that may have happened in pregnancy or in the very early months of life or something, how can you work with them?
So often you'll find that people have heard stories. So if a mother had a real, the birth experience for some mothers and babies is life-threatening. So if people have that information or can obtain it, I ask for it. Not in great depth. I don't want people to go into a lot of detail. They don't need to. But the thing is, we can turn off those, what I call videotape loops that are going round and round and round in somebody's system. Sometimes they're it's the videotape loop that is just constantly on automatic repeat, and other times it's a videotape loop that's just waiting for someone to press play, for something to trigger it. And those things can be anything from, a pattern of attracting unhealthy relationships, being attracted to unhealthy relationships. It can be, there are some people who are just accident prone. Well, where do you think that starts? It starts as a pattern, as a belief and a pattern, and then it repeats itself because our brain seeks coherence, It can be that whole thing of whatever I do, I'm never enough. So you can get Olympians who never feel like they're enough, no matter what they achieve.
Very common. That's a very common thing, isn't it?
Very.
Yes. Now, the other thing I wanted to ask you, understand that the individuals you work with, you're not actually asking them to relive these experiences. Quite often it's so terrifying. If it is extreme, it's too terrifying to look at. So tell me more about that.
So the way the Richards trauma process differs to a lot of therapies is that we don't need to hear people's stories. We don't need to talk about it. In fact, in so many situations, it's actually counterproductive because we don't want neurons, flooding to those superhighways that are already there that actually don't serve that person. And often in talking about our experience, our traumatic or distressing experience, we're deepening those unwanted neural highways. So we work with the subconscious in order to change this stuff, because that's where it's stored. We can consciously think, I'm safe, and no, I'm safe. And yet we can have a panic attack, even though we consciously know we're safe. It's because our subconscious runs our behavior, our lives, sort of 95% of the time. And if it thinks, I'm not safe, you're not safe, I'm going to protect you, it'll throw you into a panic attack or into anxiety, even when you consciously know that you're safe.
Because your subconscious doesn't know that. I'm thinking of perhaps on a wintry afternoon being by a cozy fire, which seems like such a safe place to be. But if someone has ever been frightened or in danger by a house fire or something, that might be enough to trigger some deep feelings. There A colleague was telling me about one of her clients the other day who, whenever she was in the kitchen and there was a man, any man, who spoke in a loud voice, whether or not it was directed at her, it might have been directed at the politics on the TV, she would go into a fight, flight, freeze, for her, freeze. Because when she was a child, her mother was threatened by her father with a knife in the kitchen.
And so, and you can still deal with this stuff, even if this is the thing with traumatic memories for children. Sometimes they are suppressed, and that's a survival mechanism as well. We don't need to remember them in order for it to be resolved. It sounds crazy, but we don't.
So, I mean, I've seen the words deep reimagining involved with this method. Is that something you could explain?
Yeah. So, in order to resolve this stuff, whether it's extreme trauma or barriers to our success or our best performance, in order to resolve it, we need to work with the subconscious. And one of the languages of the subconscious is the imagination. Now, the subconscious or unconscious, I personally use those terms interchangeably, can't tell the difference between something that's really happened and something that we have richly imagined. So an example, a sort of everyday example might be people who are catastrophizers or worriers, and they imagine the worst possible case scenario outcome. They will get stressed. Their body will get stressed. They won't be able to think clearly. That's a sort of everyday kind of example. Another example is, studies that have been done, for example, on there's this study that was done on piano players, right? People who hadn't played the piano before. One group was given a 5-finger exercise to play over a certain number of weeks for a certain number of minutes or hours per day. There was another group that was given the task of just richly imagining or mentally rehearsing. I think they were the terms that they used for this study. Mentally rehearsing that 5-finger exercise. And then there was a control group who didn't do anything, right? The changes in the brain, the neurological changes that happened for the group that actually played the 5-finger exercise were the same as those who mentally rehearsed it.
And I have another example I read years ago about 2 basketball teams who did exactly the same thing. It was under the heading of visualization. So one team practiced for a fortnight. The other team simply did all the moves that they would have done on the court, but in their heads. And I read that the amount of improvement for each team was not that different.
Yeah. I mean, and there are even, studies where people have imagined doing workouts, right? And their strength improves and their muscle mass increases.
I must try that.
Yeah, really.
While lying down on the couch, I must try that.
I remember reading a yogi's account. I wish I could remember which one it was, but he said, if you're ever sick and you can't exercise, imagine you're walking up a hill. And I remember thinking, please. Well, science proves now that the changes are significant if we really richly imagine doing something. Our subconscious believes it.
So that is how you work. You work at that level.
Yeah.
And I understand that you are you're helping people to become empowered as they were not when this happened, whatever it was.
Yep. Yeah. The process really helps people get their power back. It frees them from the past. Some people feel stuck in the past, like there are chains attaching them, and they can't move on. And so many people come to me who have done countless therapies. Another person just called up the other day, yesterday, and said, look, I've done so much. I've done so many therapies. And because I've had so many people in that situation, I can now say, you know what? Doesn't matter. This works. Does it work 100% of the time? No, nothing does.
There must be some people who say, well, it hasn't worked for me.
Yep. And usually that's because either they haven't followed instructions properly or fully engaged, Or in some cases, and I don't find this happens very often, but in some cases they have a reason for staying stuck where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they're not even aware of that reason. Sometimes the reason is unconscious. And normally, if there is, and we refer to that as a secondary gain, normally if there is a secondary gain, we figure it out and we work through it and it's fine. Mm. But there is the odd occasion where somebody deep down would prefer to stay where they are than get well. Mm. And the other situation where it might not work is if somebody gets to the point where they're really, really well, they're fantastic, life's just brilliant, and then they go back into a toxic environment. So, an extreme example might be somebody who, breaks their addictions. Let's just say they took drugs for a certain period of their lives. They're clean. They've done the work on the trauma, which usually was the reason that they were drawn to drugs to begin with. They've done the work on the trauma, and they're great. And then they go back and they hang out with friends who are still doing drugs. Mm. Mm. Or somebody who gets to the place where they're really, really empowered and then goes back to a partner who's narcissistic or manipulative or controlling. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they're drawn back to where they were. This sounds like such an interesting method for prisons. Do you know any therapists who have worked with TRTP in prisons?
No. And my guess would be it's because they're still in a toxic environment. A lot of us have worked with people who have been in prison in the past, mm-hmm, mm-hmm, or who've been offenders in the past. But if they're going straight back into an environment where there is a lot of toxicity and stress and all sorts of stuff, then you'd better to wait until they're out of there. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm. So, is there another example that you might want to touch on without divulging any confidentiality, of course, Sally, of how this process has worked well?
Yeah. And I would say that in terms of, so we do depression, anxiety, stress scores, DAS forms, with everybody, with our clients at the beginning of the process, the first session, and at the end of the process, which is, at the beginning of the third session. So there are usually 3 sessions. Sessions are 1.5 hours to 2 hours, so they're slightly longer than most other therapies. And a little caveat on that, sometimes it varies a bit. Sometimes we need to work with people a little bit differently, but that's the general framework. So we do a DAS form at the beginning of the first session and a DAS form at the beginning of the third session. And it's around 90% of people who have had severe or extremely severe depression, anxiety, or stress. About 90% of those people come down to a normal rating in that period of time. And a lot of us also do, we have a bit of a check-in, because it's just, it's kind of a wonderful privilege to be able to see the transformation in people's lives. So some of us check in a month after the process, a month after we've worked with that client, or maybe even 6 months, just depends. And the results, they stick as long as somebody isn't going back into a toxic environment. And of course, if big life stuff happens, the loss of a loved one, or of course things, it's not like a magic pill for the rest of your life. But the big stuff, has kind of been done. The stuff from the past has been done. And then clients are in a position to be able to choose their way forward, So I'll tell you a couple of different client stories. And these are clients who've actually given permission for me to share their stories. I'm not going to share their names, obviously. But one client had a very traumatic childhood, as you know, quite a lot of my clients do, whether it's childhood sexual abuse or domestic violence, growing up in that sort of situation. And she wound up with PTSD later in life. She also had a very traumatic experience with one of her partners when she was an adult. And that's what really flipped her into PTSD. So nightmares and all the horror that goes along with that. Brain fog, not being able to think clearly, being on high alert all the time. So for this particular client, we did 4 sessions. And I actually pulled out some words that she wrote to me after her process. This is a very high-functioning person, quite successful, even when she had PTSD, which is kind of amazing. She said, proudly reporting in that I've never been so busy with work and getting away, but never so consciously aware that I now have a choice to not buy into that, but rock on anyway and achieve exactly the same amazing outcome, but with my stomach, nerves, and head intact.
Oh.
This is a new experience for me, and I believe I will call it peaceful excellence.
Well, you mentioned 2 stories, but let's just stick with that because it's a remarkable story. I love it, and you would too. Sal, how has your own life been affected or changed by this work?
Even you're asking this question, I'm getting all these goosebumps, Alix. So, in so many ways. Firstly, working with people and seeing these results is one of the most exciting things a practitioner can experience, whether it's somebody going from no self-belief to just oozing self-belief, or someone going from PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks to nothing.
Peaceful excellence.
Peaceful excellence. It's elating. And I often get texts and things from past clients saying, just letting you know, I've got a boyfriend now, and I'm, wonderful things. And that, of course, has a huge positive impact on my life. To feel that you're really contributing and making a difference. And it's not the thing is, it's not me doing it to the client. It's empowering other people so that they're in a position to lead the lives they want to lead. It's really empowering them, helping them to empower themselves. That's really what this therapy is about. I mean, yes, of course, we're guiding them every step of the way, and the practitioner knows what to do. They don't know what to do. So of course we're guiding them, but it's the client who's doing it. So it's a very empowering process, both for the practitioner, but also for the client.
You're facilitating. Yes. Them.
Yes. And also, so a lot of practitioners come across TRTP because they do it as a client, and then it's like, oh my God, okay, I've got to learn how to do this and help other people. I was in a different situation in that I was like, I'm cool. I'm fine. I don't really need this, but it was part of the, so to become a practitioner, obviously you have to go through the process yourself. And I went into it thinking, oh, well, this will be interesting. Thinking I didn't really need it. And it's changed me on such a profound level that here's the thing. We're so used to our normal. My normal, which I hadn't even thought to question because it just seemed like it had always been like that, was actually carrying around a whole lot of guilt. I had imposter syndrome for a long time. I had perfectionism for a long time. And I'm talking, the kind of perfectionism that's a straitjacket, not the kind of striving to perfection because it's fun and it's rewarding and it's amazing. I mean, that is, of course, a part of it, but it was also that perfectionism of I'm not enough. Whatever I do, I'm not enough. irrelevant of what I achieved. No, it's not enough. And once I did the process, I suddenly experienced life without just this burden of guilt, feeling like when things went wrong, it was my fault. And, you know, and I was one of those very fortunate people who had a blessed childhood. It's amazing what we can normalize. There are some clients who come and it was so normal for their parents to yell and scream at each other all the time. They just didn't question it. And it, you know, it has an ongoing effect on them in their lives, growing up feeling unsafe. But they're like, oh, no, they pretty much had a screaming match every night. Oh, you know.
That was all right.
Yeah. It's amazing what we can normalize as children. We often don't question things. I was talking to my family the other day, my parents, you know, as a little kid, this will make you laugh. Mum and Dad had this plant holder that was a polar bear head. And it scared the living daylights out of me. Like every time I had to go into that room, I'd be skirting around this polar bear head. I was absolutely terrified of it. But I didn't think to say, Mum, that thing scares me. I just didn't think to say that. It was just there. It was a part of our house, part of just the stuff that was around. So I didn't think to even tell them. And that's just the tiniest example, you know?
Well, I just think being little, you're immediately helpless with these giant people in your life, aren't you? So I imagine every one of us has something that frightened us as a child we're still a child within us, aren't we? Now, I'd love to go on forever with this. It's been so interesting talking to you. And, I've learned a lot, and I look forward to other chats maybe in the future. But thank you for being on the other side of the microphone for a change.
Oh, Alix, thank you for suggesting this and for interviewing me. I'm not used to doing this much talking. I'm used to hearing the other person talk, but I will look forward to interviewing you, particularly about your book. And so listeners and viewers, you have that to look forward to. Thank you so much, Alix. And all of those people who joined us, whether it's on the podcast or on YouTube there, thank you for being a part of our community and for really being a part of this conversation. And we will look forward to joining with you on the waves next time. Bye, everyone.